Good afternoon. Um, yeah, like Shri Priya said, I hope everybody is doing all right and you've had at least some kind of restorative weekend. Um, we'll we're here for the second half of the grief and bereavement module, and just to recap, in the last session, what we did was we talked about the different frameworks of grief. We talked about the stages as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has talked about it, and also some contemporary models. We've talked about the fact that grief has three aspects of how it is experienced, how it is expressed, and how people adapt to it. We also touched upon the different aspects of anticipatory, disenfranchised, and complicated grief. And we looked a little bit at the difference between grief and depression, how we can manage grief, and what are the goals of care when we encounter somebody who is grieving. So I will be sharing the complete slide deck with you after this session is over. I just wanted to, while we wait for more people to file into the room, just do a quick check-in if any thoughts or reflections or questions came up from the last session that you might want to, like we can spend maybe 5 minutes taking those up before we get into today's section. Oh, and where is the check-in word for everybody? How is everyone doing? If you prefer a number, give me a number. And 1 to 10, 10 being distressed. I think we're expecting at least 10 more people, Shri. I have to, I think,
Yes.
yeah. Yours is a very stubborn 6, Shri Priya. Okay, a little tired. Okay. Any thoughts or reflections from last week's session? We can spend a few minutes on that if anyone would like to share. Thank you, Shalaka. Firdaus, 7. Okay. All right, let's get right into it then. So today we're going to focus on bereavement. And bereavement, oftentimes, I mean, like in this session also, you will find that grief and bereavement are usually, they go hand in hand. And so a lot of the times what happens as a result of that is that grief is only associated with death. But as we saw in the previous session, grief is associated with any loss of any kind, of any significance to us. So grief that way shows up in many forms before the actual bereavement takes place. Now, today we're going to specifically deal with bereavement, and I'm really hoping that my slide deck behaves itself. Okay. So bereavement is a period of intense suffering. So bereavement is actually the actual event of the death. Okay. So the person, the death takes place, and what follows is a period of bereavement, or the event itself is called bereavement. And intense suffering, the suffering can take many forms, as we saw, and we'll just talk about that a little bit more. It is a time when we see a fair bit of impaired interpersonal and social relationships in the family and amongst caregivers. It's not always the case, but this is the time when we see a lot of impairment. And impairment doesn't necessarily mean that it's a permanent kind of state. Uh, Maybe in the immediate aftermath of the death of somebody, people are so uh, caught up in their own emotions, and it's a very inward looking time. So interpersonal and social relationships can get disrupted for the time being. It is associated with elevated risks to mental health, morbidity, and mortality. Okay. We find this also happening in a significant population of older couples. When one person in the couple dies, quite often we find that the partner dies not too much later, and especially if they're very interdependent on one another. And we see that, yes, even especially amongst the male population, this is a time when several parameters in their health shifts. We know that the way in which we grieve, the way in which we experience suffering has marked effect on our bodies, on our immune systems, and therefore this is the time also when there'll be disruptions in all kinds of ways in which our bodies function, and so there is an elevated risk at this point. And studies indicate that about 10 to 20% have a difficult time integrating the loss. I mean, we're talking about complicated grief, we're talking about other mental health issues, and so on. Okay, so this is basically a footprint of what bereavement can look like. But let's talk about some of the emotions that can be felt during bereavement. What are some of the emotions that you can feel at bereavement? What are some of the emotions that can be felt when somebody close to us dies? Lost, feeling lost, yeah. Hypersensitivity, okay. Sadness, anger, numbness, guilt, shock, disbelief, isolation, hopelessness, yeah. Emotional instability, yes. Depression, yeah. All of you are absolutely on the nose with this. A time of silence, yeah. And that silence can be experienced in different ways. If they've died after a long illness, a sense of relief, yeah. No hunger. That's an interesting way. We talked about how grief also manifests physically, right? So yeah, it can actually turn into some sort of a physical manifestation also. So sadness, of course, we associate a time of bereavement with sadness. Uh, like some of you said, anger. Anger is a very common feeling. Numbness. Somebody has talked about numbness. Panic and anxiety, uh, instability, feeling like the ground beneath your feet has moved. And some people have panic attacks. They have anxiety attacks. Like one of you said, relief that it's over. It's over. And oftentimes with relief also comes a sense of guilt, this ball and chain with this guilt that follows you around everywhere. And the guilt can come from feeling relieved. It can come from not feeling like you haven't done enough. Survivor's guilt. It can come from all kinds of, especially when young children die, when young people die, the guilt that older people feel, that's very, very common. And so it's a very mixed bag of emotions. And between each of these, there's a spectrum of other emotions also that can be felt. And like we talked about in the grief framework, you can bounce from feeling angry to relief to sad to numb to panicky to guilt, or you may not feel much at all and you're pretty much numb through the whole thing. So all of these are absolutely normal emotions that are felt at the time of bereavement, and none of them is abnormal, unless of course it continues in a way that stops you from being able to actively participate in your own life. It disrupts your health, it disrupts your relationships to a significant level. So all of these are very common and very normal experiences to have. Now, following the death, we have to remember that it's not just, the death happens and then uh, it's a straight road ahead. Uh, you have, broadly speaking, you have to go through three kinds of losses. First is the immediate loss of the person itself. And then come secondary losses. What could some of those secondary losses be? Secondary losses. I've lost the person. What else have I lost? Economic, yeah, okay, economic instability. So economic stability might be lost. Okay, yeah, that person could have been the breadwinner, or now I don't have any finances left because I've spent it all on the treatment. I've spent the whatever little I have now on the funeral arrangements. I have had to host people. Loss of support, not just from the person who you cared about, but also maybe you had a team of doctors and palliative care people coming over all the time, and now they don't have any reason to come over. So the care team also stops coming, right? Relationship, not just with the person, but with others. Yeah. Um, loss of a future with that person. Okay, further losses. Now, some of your responses could come into either of these categories, secondary or further. Okay, social status, losing decision-making power, those are very important things. Those come under the category of further losses. Secondary losses. I lose this person who used to fulfill a particular role in the family, an emotional role in the family. This used to be the person that used to give me advice. This used to be the person who gave me guidance. This is the person who told me how to manage my, my bank accounts. So it could be those things. Confidence levels. Yeah. So there are, and as we go through this experience of bereavement and then the days that follow, slowly we realize what else has gone with that person. And sometimes this sort of revelation comes very poignantly, like, for me, I mean, I've talked about it with someone that uh, it took me 6 months later to realize that there's no one in the family now who can tell me the family recipes. And I wish I'd written them down. And I did write a few of them down, but I remember picking up the phone 6 months after my mother had died and just mindlessly calling her number because I needed some advice on something I was cooking. And then I realized, oh, she's not available for that. So these losses sneak up on you, and if you've lost a parent, then you've lost the role of a grandparent for your child. Suddenly that elder is gone in the family. It could be somebody who was the keeper of all the family stories. Now those stories are gone. So you encounter these losses over a period of time, and you encounter them in very strange ways. It could be that suddenly I'm getting a letter from the car insurance people, and that was something I never had to look after. I've lost that person who manages all those things, all those practical things in life. So as we go through the process of bereavement and grief, other losses start emerging. And we also find sometimes that if it's two parents and they have a child, then they suddenly realize what the other parent used to do for the child, which now you have to do. It could be things like packing them lunch for school. You've never had to do it so far. Now you have to do it. So all of those adaptations take place, and with each one of these realizations there comes a fresh wave of grief, because there is the stuff that is visible that is lost, there is the stuff that is invisible that you're realizing as time goes on, and a lot of those have to do with role changes. And for caregivers, it sometimes feels like the loss of purpose. That's a very, very important point, Aparna. Thank you so much, because like you said, that's become the whole point of their existence for the last how many ever months or years. And sometimes people give up huge parts of their lives in order to fulfill this particular purpose of looking after somebody. And now suddenly you have all this time and this void. For a lot of caregivers, it's very difficult to re-engage with the workforce. But it becomes a necessity because now you have to earn, you have to keep, you have to keep the engines running. And that loss of confidence that someone talked about. Sorry, can you hear me, Shri?
Yes, you are audible.
I'm just going to switch my video off for a few seconds. So till it stabilizes. Yeah. Yeah, so all these things keep coming up, and I think it's a lifetime's work really to really familiarize ourselves with what all is lost in the bargain. Now, again, I want to say that we are saying this assuming that the relationship was a healthy and a positive one. There are many relationships that are not healthy, that are not positive, and there's a different kind of experience after that. Okay. For some people, that person would have been the target of their anger and their blame right through their lives. Okay. So for some people, it could be that person could have been their excuse to not engage with other aspects of life. I can't do this because I'm a caregiver. no, I'm not able to travel because, and now suddenly that is also gone. And further losses, like some of you talked about, it could be in terms of your purpose, in terms of your, your sense of bearing in the world, and so on and so forth. So it's always uh, good for us to remember that the loss does not end with just the loss of the person, but we have to constantly monitor all the other losses that might be coming up for this, for the bereaved person, that they were not even aware of and what were not prepared for. um, it's also important for us to remember that there are always protective factors, and these are factors that we need to look out for in the people that we are trying to support. How much social support does this person have with the family and with community? If they have a certain degree of social support, that is a protective factor. And by protective factor, I mean something that will help them cope with the bereavement in a healthier way. Okay, that's what I mean by a protective factor. Healthy coping styles. And that includes personality traits and previous experiences. Can we talk about this coping styles for a minute? What might be a healthy coping style? What might be an unhealthy coping style? Let's start with some unhealthy coping styles. What could be an unhealthy coping style? And like I said, when we were talking about the genogram and, family dynamics, something that has been unhealthy to start with at a time of crisis only gets worse. Okay? Yeah. Substance abuse, binge eating, misplaced aggression, blame. Yeah, these are unhealthy coping styles. And these are not styles that emerge overnight after the bereavement. These are styles that we have harbored right through our lives. And at this time, these become particularly more intensive. Okay. Continuous weeping is a sign of being unable to regulate your emotions. There are people who are able to regulate their emotions, and by regulate, I don't mean cut off their emotions. They're able to manage their emotions. Okay. Yeah. Addictions, shopping, sexual deviance, anger, uh, even things like fatalism, not just saying, I have no control over this. There's nothing I can do about this. And this is just something that now this is the way it's going to be. Neglect. Neglect, yeah. So these are some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms where people cut themselves off. There are people who won't express their emotions, forget seeking help with a counselor or a therapist. They won't even express their emotions within their family. And sometimes that, what we talked about, the intuitive and instrumental kind of coping, of expression of grief, if we swing too far into one side, that can become unhealthy. If we're only stuck in problem solving mode, it works for a little while, but after a while, this emotion is not coming down to the heart level. It's not being processed, and it's just stuck here. So somewhere it's going to come out either in a physical health issue, or in some other way or form, or in aggression, in conflict within relationships, and so on. Yeah, anger, self-harm. And what do we see in children when it's unhealthy coping mechanisms? What do we see when it's a child who's coping badly? How might unhealthy coping mechanisms show up there? Tantrums, what else? Conduct issues, yeah. Denial, irritability, fighting with other kids, getting into trouble, bunking class, not doing their homework, excessive sleeping, or, just playing video games all the time and not engaging with other people. All of these. What are conduct issues? Conduct issues, who had brought it up? Conduct issues, Neeta had talked about. Does anyone want to talk about some of the conduct issues that children will demonstrate? Yeah, like Aparna saying, getting into trouble, bunking.
Answering back, being abusive, using bad language, deliberately to irritate the elders.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They could, and a lot of it would be very uncharacteristic behavior, or behavior that is not usually how the child would behave. In some cases, you will see with younger children, you'll see bedwetting, things like that. You'll see them, you know, uh, doing things like Um, sorry, yeah. So yeah, picking fights, things like that. Bullying their siblings. So a lot of these are unhealthy. What are some of the healthy coping mechanisms that adults and children might employ? What are some of the healthy coping mechanisms? Speaking up, acceptance. Okay, so these are storytelling to remember their loved ones. Yeah, not losing how to articulate and regulate. Asking for help. Asking for help is a big one. Yeah. Seeking help is actually one of, it's very powerful, but the thing is, in our culture, it's not encouraged, especially when it comes to something like this. It's a family issue. I mean, it's not a mental health problem. It's a family thing. So asking for help seems very, people don't encourage it that much, even within the family. So those kind of things. So spending time with closed ones, also um, taking the time to rest, to restore yourself, especially after a long marathon of caregiving, understanding that this role is now over, but also taking some time to reset where you are. Okay. And so this is, and also perhaps maybe, physical exercise, spending time with loved ones who are able to understand. Sometimes you can't talk to the people immediately close to you in the family. Sometimes you need to talk to cousins. Sometimes you need to talk to friends. So those kind of things. So looking out for these kind of things is like you need to know what those coping mechanisms are and to encourage that. Resilience is a very, again, it's like one of those dignity and love and joy words. Resilience is also talked about a lot. Resilience is the ability a person has to overcome a difficulty and then re-engage. Okay, it's resilience. And people keep saying children are so resilient, children are so resilient. And sometimes we use that as an excuse to not engage with them at a time like this. Oh, children are so resilient, they'll get over it. And sometimes in that, we do not allow them the chance to express what they might be experiencing. So we will deal with that in the children's module a little bit more in detail. But resilience is also a trait that can be developed over time when people go through hardship. And over a period of time, they develop the tools to continue to move forward, even though things are difficult. In time, you realize, okay, I have these reserves in me. I have the ability to take care of myself like this. And as people go through difficult periods of time, they will then arm themselves with these tools so that they're able to bounce back a little bit faster. Ability to communicate. A lot of you in the chat box have talked about, this communicating with other people, speaking up, speaking out, interacting. But not everybody has the ability to communicate emotional uh, content. I mean, we can talk about practical issues, all day long. We can talk about what issues there are in the house that need to be fixed, what problems need to be organized, need to be set straight. But how many of us have the vocabulary to express difficult emotions in the family in a way that it is received? Does the family have the ability to receive this kind of emotional content? Because there might be people in the family who are not comfortable with it. There are people in the family who don't want to go there. Maybe they have an entirely different set of coping skills. And coping skills, a lot of a very, very, I mean, not what can become a very unhealthy coping skill is avoiding a topic. And that's one thing we also culturally do. When somebody dies, we try and avoid speaking about them because people think that it's going to rake up raw and painful memories. But the truth is, we never forget the person. And sometimes it's a relief to talk about them. But we're not allowed that space. I know people who just after the person has died, they're like, okay, that chapter in our life is closed and we are not going to go there again. Or some people go the other extreme and that's all they talk about. And after a while, it becomes burdensome on the listener because they no longer know what they're supposed to do with this information that they're getting. They can't fix it. They can't help. the person is not getting out of this constant talking about. And what happens there is that what I've also experienced is a lot of the times people will go and relive and relive and relive procedures that went wrong, interventions that didn't work. This doctor told us to do this, we should have done that, and they get stuck in that sort of a zone, and it's very difficult for somebody who's not been there to continue having a conversation. So it leads to a little bit of isolation. So what are we communicating? Are we talking about how difficult this is for us? Sometimes I find that, people want to talk about things like they can smell the person's scent in the air, or they've had dreams about the person, or I know it's irrational, but I was walking down the street and I saw someone who looked just like my mother. And you don't want to talk about it for fear of sounding crazy. But those are all very, very normal experiences in bereavement where, the presence of the person still lingers. And so communication, yes, but the ability to communicate what actually needs to be expressed are two different things. Okay. And who are we talking to? Is the other person on the same level to receive it? And in that case, sometimes it's good to talk to a third person, to an outsider, to a counselor. And sometimes people have to be given the vocabulary to express their grief, like children. Okay, children don't know how to express grief the way adults might, but their grief comes out in different ways. So also are we equipped in that vocabulary, right? I know people who've never used an emotional word, who've never used an emotional word while talking about themselves, who have an armor that they put up. There are some people who take pride in being stoic. So how do we get through to people like them when they themselves don't have the language to express what they are feeling? Okay, so communication skills, sometimes we have to be able to give them the vocabulary, and that's when open-ended questions that we talked about in communication come in. Open-ended questions. What are some of the open-ended questions that you can ask someone that will allow them to express their grief? I find very often that I'll say, tell me a funny story about your dad. And it's such an out of the box thing to ask because no one is thinking about a funny story at that point. But what it does is it triggers a happy memory. And that allows you to remember the person in a safe way. If I know the person, if I've been in contact with that patient, I will probably start a conversation by saying, hey, there was this one time that I was sitting with your dad, and he said something that was very thoughtful. And what that'll trigger is, oh yeah, my dad was always like that. He'd always say stuff like that, even to strangers. So that's a safe entry point to getting them to share those kind of. So it doesn't always have to be about how they feel about the death of the person. Sometimes the easiest way to get into that conversation is by asking them to talk about a memory that is happy. What kind of music did your dad listen to? Is your taste in music something that you inherited from one of your parents? So things like that. So giving somebody the vocabulary to express it, and through that storytelling, you will find that their emotions will come out. Their how they felt about that relationship will come out. I will say though that you have to be ready for what they're going to share with you. So be careful when you're opening that door. Make sure that you have time to sit with them and not open that door and leave. So that's one way in which we can actually give them the language. And appropriateness and timely healthcare responses. Appropriate and timely healthcare responses. Did they receive care when they needed it? If they got timely healthcare, usually the bereavement process is easier. Yes, we did all we could. Yes, we detected it when it was still in the earlier stages. Yeah, we went to this doctor. We got two opinions. The opinions were the same. They all agreed on the same thing. Yeah, we got palliative care. He or she was not in pain. So if you get appropriate and timely healthcare responses, it is a protective factor, which leads us to the opposite. When people don't get timely and appropriate healthcare responses, that leaves a lot more bitterness and anger and pain and resentment and difficulty. That surgery was absolutely not needed. I wish we hadn't taken him to the ICU. This also ties back to complicated grief, circumstances under which the person died. Did they die alone? Did they die in pain? Were they agitated? Those kind of things. So this is where appropriate and timely healthcare responses is an important. So if there is something that the person is sharing with you, saying, yes, that nurse she was fantastic, or the doctor did the right thing, those are things to build on. I'm going to just spend a little bit more time on anger, because this is a very difficult emotion when it comes to bereavement and as part of grief also, because our social attitudes don't encourage people to express anger even in positive ways. Anger is seen as a negative emotion. It is seen as a bad emotion. It is seen as a volatile emotion in most cases. Okay. And it is difficult to express because it's one of the most powerful feelings. Anger feels like it can overwhelm you. It can be really menacing. And if you've had a time when you felt intense, overpowering anger, you know how it is, right? That's one of those emotions that bring you to the brink of losing control. And therefore, we try not to go there. But if we harbor anger without expressing it, so remember, just like grief, there is the experience of it, there's the expression of it, and then there is the adaptation to it. You can experience it without expressing it. Yeah. So here, if we are experiencing it and we don't have the ability or the permission to express it, especially when you're angry with the patient. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes here. What is the pervasive response to a caregiver being angry towards the patient? What is the pervasive response when there is anger coming up towards the patient? Shock. Disapproval. Yeah. We do tend to scold. Yeah, we scold the patient. We scold them. You're not taking your medicine. What is this? If you don't eat, how will you get better? That's a different kind. That's facilitating their care. But actual true anger towards the patient as a person. So the difference is I'm annoyed at your action of not taking your pills in time versus I just hate this person. I'm tired of what this person has made me go through. Yeah, so what you're all talking about, frustration, irritability, all of that, neglect. But what is society's response to us? Whose needs are prioritized? Yours or the patient's? The patient's needs. How dare you? This person is living with cancer. This person is living with dementia. You can't be angry with them. Yeah, you corner the caregiver. It is not permitted in our culture to express anger towards the patient. And the sad thing is, we forget that the patients were human even before they got sick. And some of them were very unpleasant humans. Not all patients have been angels. But look at the language we use around caregiving, right? It is an act of service. It is your duty. It is such a, it is uh, you've been blessed to be able to look after your sick mother-in-law. Your mother-in-law has been sitting and giving you tanas from the day you've come into this household, but it is such a privilege to look after her when she's sick, you know? I mean, I'm using some stereotypes here. I'm very aware of that. It could very well just be your brother who's been fighting with you all your life. But we don't permit anger. And you are seen as the villain. Now, remember I told you that story of that lady who was married for 40 years and her husband insisted on abusing her even though he had ALS. And it's very difficult for us as healthcare professionals to, you know, to empathize with what is going on for various reasons. And in fact, it was the daughter who said, my father has been abusive towards my mother as long as I can remember. And this is just another way of him being abusive. He's controlling her even now. Now, what do you do in that situation? You still have to give them, your duty of care is there. Um, so I wouldn't blame a lot of caregivers also. The anger is not, maybe the anger is not directly at the person per se, but it's because of all the other frustrations in life. I've had to sell my house. I don't know where I'm going to be after this. You know, in my case, I was left with a lot of uh, issues because of the city that my mother died in. There was a lot of practical issues. There were a lot of people who I did know who were showing up from out of the woodwork, demanding things. And one of the things I felt after my mother died was anger towards her because she hadn't prepared me for this. And I was really angry at my mother for about 3-4 months after she died. And for me, it was like my brother would sit there and look at her photo and cry. I would sit there and I'd be glaring at it because I'm like, he doesn't live here. He lives in Dubai. I'm here I did all the heavy lifting before she got sick. I mean, before she died. And I'm still doing the heavy lifting now. And I'm being very honest with you. Those were some of the most dominant emotions in my psyche at the time. I went through intense therapy for it, but they were normal reactions. And when someone came to me at that point and said, you were such a good daughter, she'd be so proud of you. My God, I mean, by saying that to me, it compounded my anger 10 times more. I said, and then someone said, you're so blessed. I said, you try doing a manual evacuation at 3 o'clock in the morning and tell me that's a feeling of being blessed. It's not. So please don't, and then you feel guilty because people are trying to be supportive. They're trying to prop you up. And all I'm feeling in response is, please don't, one more person comes here and tells me I was a great daughter, they won't be allowed here again. And I remember my brother looking at me at that time saying, God, you got to get that attitude under control. So again, that made my anger even worse. So it is very, very complex, but I had the safe space of expressing it. One of the good things of being in palliative care and mental health is that there are many people who recognize that. And so there was this outlet for it. And it's very, very difficult to process that anger in a healthy fashion. And it's okay for it to sometimes come out in an unhealthy fashion. That's also okay. What's important is for us as the people there to realize that this is not a mark of their personality. It is coming from a place of deep hurt and deep pain, even if the relationship with the deceased was not a good relationship. Now, unexpressed anger can manifest in many, many ways. It can manifest as just hurt feelings, grudges, silent grudges, guilt, overreaction, irrational, explosive outbursts, unable to function socially, social withdrawal, depression, apathy. Apathy is one of the saddest things because then you feel nothing towards everything. And that's one of the most, to me, apathy feels like, when you have a thermostat that has to cut off at that point. That's what apathy feels like, that you're pushed and pushed and pushed to that limit, and then boom, it's short circuits. After that, you feel nothing. And that can be a very difficult place to get someone back from. Low self-esteem and substance use. These are all ways in which anger that is not expressed can come out. And so we need to be mindful of this. And if you're seeing somebody having these very sort of negative responses, it would do us well to explore whether they have any anger issues. What do we do when we are providing bereavement support? Why are we providing bereavement support? Firstly, to identify and support healthy coping strategies. I would say, remember the mediators of mourning. Who died? What was their relationship? 1 second, I'm gonna stop my video for a second. Yeah. So if you remember the mediators of mourning that we talked about, that's what comes into play here, right? How do you know what somebody's coping strategies are? How do you know what is protective? It's by asking them those mediator of mourning questions. Have you been through something like this before? What is the worst thing you've gone through in your life apart from this death? How did you deal with it then? Who do you look to for support right now? Um, Tell me more about your relationship with you. I mean, like I said, you can use some, inroads through questions like tell me a story about your dad or tell me a story about whoever it is. But um, try and understand what the relationship with that person was, what are their coping strategies, and then see what those healthy coping strategies are, identify them, and then build on it. So if they are somebody who sees or seeks comfort externally, whether it's through their, and remember the eco map, draw up a mental eco map of this person now, because as you would do for the patient when they were sick, you need to draw up an eco map for this, for the bereaved caregiver after the person dies. That's something that I try and do mentally. So has that eco map changed now that this person has died? With the death of this person, has a part of that eco map disappeared? Has something new come in? What is the relationship with colleagues at work? What is the relationship with the church congregation? Does she go for a satsang? Does she, does this person now want to spend more time with his or her friends? And try and see what those coping strategies that can be enabled in those spaces are. So the EcoMap's job is not done. The EcoMap will be your tool, a very powerful tool to even help you navigate the territory of grief and bereavement. And then, of course, we have to identify and reduce risk factors. Are they someone who has been drinking heavily ever since? Is it somebody who's now their lifestyle has changed? They used to be a lot more organized, and they were the ones who were organizing the prescriptions and the doctor's appointments and everything. And now when you walk in, everything is a mess. So has the family moved away? So does somebody else need to be brought into the caregiving circle? So is this person now like earlier, at least, she had whatever, even if she was looking after the person, there was still company. Now the doctors don't visit, the nurses don't visit, we don't, those engagements are gone. So who else is there now taking that place? All those people who you had socially withdrawn from because you were a caregiver, is there a way to reconnect you with those folks? Identify and facilitate the protective factors that I just talked about: social support, coping skills, communication skills, all of that, and establish a channel for future support with yourself. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute, how to do that. Okay. So the aim is that, and our goals are really to facilitate the grieving process, to really walk them through it, to provide emotional support. And emotional support can be provided very simply by asking open-ended questions, by being there with practical problem-solving sort of strategies and so on. Help them to manage their stress and anxiety, address practical concerns. They might have some very practical concerns, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, and facilitate meaning making. This is a difficult one. I would say meaning making or peacemaking. Sometimes you can't make meaning out of what happened. And that is something that I learned when I was sitting with my therapist, and I was trying to, I was going over all these stories, and she said, Smriti, this makes sense in this context of things, in the narrative of your story, but what if it doesn't make sense? And can we just make peace with it, that it has happened? And it was a very powerful uh, insight for me that not everything has to make sense. Okay, so how do we facilitate not just meaning making, but also peacemaking? Reduce the risk of complications. How do we reduce the risk of complications? Maybe you need to bring in a medical person from the team to sit and maybe go over some of the more complicated and more, I would say, painful physical symptoms that the person had. I know that uh, I know that a lot of people are not clear about the dying process. They think that the person died in a lot of anxiety because something simple like the breathing change when a person is dying. Crassly, we call it the death rattle. But what it really is the person does not have the swallowing, ability anymore. So fluids tend to gather. So it sounds like they're gurgling and they're choking. But actually, if they're already at that point, a lot of them are not feeling it. It's more distressing to the people watching than for the person going through it. Another thing also, especially in the cancers, is this thing called cachexia, which is the person's inability to eat and absorb food. And in our cultures, feeding is such an important thing. I recently heard somebody 2 days ago saying one of the saddest things was towards the last couple of weeks, my father just didn't eat anything. He just wouldn't eat. And we would sit there and say, have a bite of khichdi, eat this. And he just wouldn't eat. And it's actually quite surprising and shocking to me how many doctors do not explain this as a part of the trajectory of advanced cancer. And actually, the fact that forcing somebody to eat actually puts burden on the body. So having a medical professional sit with the family and say, would you like to go over some of the things that happened? And they might say, this was difficult, that was difficult, to really get the science and the maybe the comfort of knowing that it was not as painful as you might have imagined. I will give you this recommendation. There's this fabulous book called With the End in Mind. I'll just put it in the chat for you. And I think this is mandatory reading for everybody. It's by a wonderful lady called Dr. Catherine Mannix. I had the privilege of meeting her. She's one of the most astonishingly beautiful storytellers. She's got a lot of experience in palliative care. She's a palliative care physician. And this is one book that I think everyone should read because she really demystifies the process of dying. And I think that this is when we educate ourselves in this kind of language, we're also able to then offer support to those who are going through it. Okay, so it's in the chat box. I suggest you can also find her on YouTube and stuff. So she's quite someone to listen to. And so sitting with them, unpacking all of those things can also reduce the risk of complicated grief, because a lot of the times complicated grief comes from certain ideas that we have that, oh, it was a difficult death, it was a traumatic death, this has happened, that has happened. So that can also help mitigate that. Okay. And of course, promote resilience and personal growth. This is a little bit tricky, but that's not to be done immediately in the aftermath of bereavement, because that takes some time. People take some time to get to this point where they're thinking of, if you remember the dual process model, loss orientation and restoration orientation, it takes some time to swing the pendulum back to restoration orientation. So that comes later. Okay, now I'll just pause for a few minutes because I know this is a heavy topic. And maybe some of you want to just stretch a little bit or get a glass of water or some tea, because grief and bereavement are not easy to sit and talk about and listen to. Any reflections, any comments so far? Any experiences that any of you would like to share? We'll just give you all a breather, 2-3 minutes. And unless someone is going to share something extremely personal and they request us to stop recording.
You talking about food and the symbolism of food in our culture reminded me of when I had someone close to me in the ICU, and I had a neighbor call me up and say, "Hey, how is this person doing?" And I said, "This person's in the ICU right now." And it was really hard. It was really hard to comprehend. It was really sudden. And then the person's response was, "Oh, but are they eating?" I was like, "No, they're in the ICU." "Yeah, but like, should I bring you idlis for this person to eat?" And I think it broke me. I just started laughing in the hospital, but it was that moment that I needed to cut off. Yeah, it is seen as like the symbol of vitality, of living, of surviving in our culture. Yeah, it's quite hard to handle.
I find it endearing that you laughed in that moment, because also it's, sometimes when that short circuits, then it comes out in this way as well. But I also feel like sometimes when people don't have the words, uh, food has become a way of us demonstrating care. Like here, I live in rural Tamil Nadu. They'll ask me, no matter whether it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 11 o'clock, "Saptacha?" And I'm like, yeah. That's it. That is the currency of care. And I suppose that is so deeply rooted in our culture that that's one of the toughest ones to work around. And to explain to somebody that it's doing more harm to somebody right now to be fed. And one of the most complicated emotional decisions is the feeding tube. The feeding tube. And the thing is that there's a lot of anger around that decision as well, And so if you look at the whole conversation around withholding or withdrawing futile interventions, one of the biggest is the feeding tube. And the question then asked is, we're going to starve this person to death. And then to have the conversation that it's not actually doing them any good it's one of the most difficult conversations to have. And at the essence of that is feeding. It's food. Yeah.
True.
It-
Is there time?
Yeah, go ahead, Indira. Sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just, about feeding tube. I think I was very conflicted when my mother, who had dementia and then had a stroke. And I really didn't want to put her on the feeding tube. And in fact, it was also difficult from another point of view because people kept telling me, oh, you just want to prolong her life. For what reason? I said, I don't know, but I asked the doctor, I said, what should I do? He said, look, you live in Bangalore. Here she is being cared by somebody. And I feel that she's at this moment, she's not able to swallow sometimes because of a stroke. And yet I don't see her as actively dying.
Mm.
So I suggest you go with the feeding tube. I will come and change it. But I really feel if you stayed here, I would have said, you feed her, you be in charge. It's going to not choke her. Otherwise, she's going to get aspiration pneumonia. And you don't want her in hospital. She didn't want to go to hospital. So that helped me make up my mind because I think her doctor was a doctor who knew all these things about her, about me, and the family situation. So it was a very difficult decision to put her on a feeding tube because I don't know whether it was going to just prolong her suffering.
Thank you, Indira, for sharing that with us. I mean, I think what's really shining in that whole story also is the thoughtfulness of that doctor, right? And he could tell you those things because he's clearly had lots of other conversations with you before that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Aparna. And it's been over a year and a half for me, and I'm going to Allahabad like next week to deal with it. So if I'm taking any sessions from Allahabad, you'll see a little bit of my frustration coming out. Hopefully not. But it's not easy. And it's sometimes what we experience after the person dies alters our story of the person before they died. Do you know what I mean? So we have this idea of the person in our heads, and then after they die, we discover things about them. And that is so, it feels like a betrayal, or it feels like, wow, it's like seismic, this shift. And I remember also having this conversation with another very dear friend, a very wise woman, and some information came to light and it shocked me. And she said something very interesting. I said, God, I have to recalibrate so much of what I know. And she said, you don't have to recalibrate, you have to reassemble. Because some foundational facts change sometimes after the person is gone. And so we can never underestimate, and it alters the quality of grief, it alters the quality of our relationship, not just with the people around us, but with the person who has already died. Now, what do you do with that relationship? Now that person is not even there to explain themselves to you, right? So it's gone. It's that opportunity is gone. So it's very, very complex. And I thank you all for you know, really putting all of this out. It's not easy to talk about these things. And I appreciate the personal stories. So, okay, let's take a deep breath and dive back right in. So there are actually, it's not just an art, it's a science. Okay, providing bereavement support is not just about showing up and asking for stories. There is a system and a strategy to it. So there are typically 5 stages of bereavement support. The first is when you first meet the patient itself. Now, I think what Indira's story just showed us was exactly that. You start gathering information about the family from the get-go so that when the time comes, you have enough information to help them take certain decisions. So your assessment, especially, I mean, and obviously I'm talking about cases where we know this is advanced illnesses and things. Your first bereavement assessment is at where your first meeting. I'm going to take you through it step by step. The second is when the person is imminently dying. It's going to happen anytime in the next 48 hours or so, okay? One is on the day of the death itself. Next is 2 weeks after the death. And finally, 1 month after the death. So these are touch points and milestones in bereavement support. And I will just take you through some strategies and actions that you can employ while you go through each of these sessions. The first is, don't be intimidated by this very busy slide. I'll take you through them one by one. So the strategy when you first meet somebody is you want to assess the caregiver's risk of complicated grief. How do you assess it? You start figuring out what the genogram is. What is the eco map? Do they have social support? Is it already a conflicted relationship? Are they, I mean, what else? Is there conflict within the family, within the siblings, so on and so forth? Is there an elevated risk of self-harm? I'm talking about the caregivers, okay, all of this, because these are the people who are going to be bereaved. If there's an elevated risk of self-harm or current high levels of psychosocial distress, should seek the help from a specialist. So typically the care spectrum is, you could be just, you could be any member of the team. So if you're a social worker, if you're a nurse, whoever it might be, you're a counselor, and if you find that, hey, there might be more issues here than is in my capacity, you need to also start, if not referring them, at least consulting with a psychologist or somebody who has the expertise in certain issues. If you find that one of the caregivers, for example, is already a heavy substance user. Yeah. So things like that. And you also, the strategy is to, at this point, provide information and psychoeducation. So we know that one of the greatest gaps in our healthcare delivery system is information given to the patient and the family in a way that they can absorb it. We've talked about it in our introduction class. We've talked about it in our assessment class. We've also talked about it in our communications classes. So what information do they have? What is their insight into the prognosis? All of those things that we've talked about in preceding classes. And how do you really operationalize all of these strategies? Like I said, you figure out how much they know about the prognosis. Do they know the disease, but do they also know what that disease means? Do they know what the trajectory is going to be? Do they have some idea of symptom management? And is the caregiver prepared for the kind of role they're going to have to play? Do they understand what their day is looking like? And I'm talking about, this is at initial intake and assessment, right? So they've probably been at it for a while. So they already have an understanding of their role. And now that things are getting more advanced, do they know what is coming? Do they know what it's going to look like as the person gets more and more dependent on them, as the person becomes more physically withdrawn because their energy levels are going to go down? Do they know what is required of them? If they haven't, obviously, I mean, I'm assuming by the time they come to you, you are a touch point to palliative care. So what palliative care can do for them? What are some of the external services available? If you do the eco map, you'll know what are some of the other services available. Maybe if they are financially not doing well, maybe they haven't tapped into some sort of a scheme yet that the government provides. Maybe they don't know about certain support groups. and you can point them to that in those directions. And assisting the primary caregiver to support their relative, and this I mean in a very, very physical and real and emotional space. Okay. One of the things that really helped was uh, we had made a whole bunch of these videos for the National Health Services Resource Center, and it's there on YouTube. Shri will we'll share the YouTube links, please, with everybody. We had actually created these modules for ASHA workers and frontline health workers on how to look after patients at the front line, so at the primary healthcare level. And I found those videos later when I was looking after my mom extremely useful in things like, how do you wash the hair of a bedbound patient? It's not as simple as we think, right? Some of us are scared to do it. What does it mean to maintain oral hygiene? And what role does that play in that person's sense of well-being? How to take care of the skin? Because when people get sick, their skin gets fragile. How to avoid contractures. These are things where, as simple as they may seem to healthcare workers, they go a long way in empowering the family caregiver. Because then I know I can do these things at home. Right? So empowering the family caregiver to support the person physically at home is one of the greatest things that the team can do. Because it really, at a time when things seem like they're spinning out of control, you're handing some control back to them. You're giving them a sense of, what would I say, strength, I suppose, or you're giving them a sense of control over what is happening. Also, educating them in, okay, we're taking care of the person here. Some symptoms are being managed. You're going to go back home. What will warrant bringing this person back to the hospital, and what can be managed at home? Again, very big, because for any caregiver to take a sick person all the way to a hospital is one of the most stressful things to do. So to let them know what will warrant a hospital visit and what will not, what does not need a hospital visit, is also it's a very, very useful thing to be done. Of course, for that, you need medical professionals on your team. And self-care strategies for the primary caregiver. Not easy at all, because especially primary caregivers, if I go by personal experience, we tend to start controlling everything. And it comes from a sense of anxiety. But everything has to be watched, everything has to be measured, everything has to be monitored. But how can they take care of themselves? It's okay to have respite care. It's okay for you to take that walk in the afternoon and put someone else in charge. It's okay to ask for help. One of the greatest things also you can do is tell them that it's absolutely fine to ask for help from a relative. I had to be reminded that. I mean, I teach classes on this, but I had to be I had to be reminded very sternly that, excuse me, you have 3 cousins in town. Can you please ask one of them to come and sit in your mother's house for 1 hour so you can step out? And I fought it, but I eventually did it. And when it happened, it was a great relief. Information on death and bereavement, if it is needed. We don't jump into this. We don't know what the acceptance levels are. We don't know if the caregivers are ready for breaking that kind of bad news to them. But like in breaking bad news, we're gauging. Okay, what does this look like to you right now? What do you think this admission is all about? How does your mother's, or how does your loved one's health seem to you at this point in time? Okay, how was it compared to even 2 weeks ago? Do you feel like she's deteriorating? Are there any conversations you need to have about that? So those kind of warning shots, the spikes protocol can be used for the caregiver at the time of, even at the time of initial assessment. Next is when death is imminent, when it is coming, when the person is not necessarily in the active, probably in the active dying phase. And now you're assessing the family's preparedness for death. We've talked about it for the last few weeks. Maybe 1 or 2 of them have been quite accepting of it. But right now, as it starts to unfold, how is everybody? And you might find that people who have seemed quite prepared and ready are suddenly panicking. Or you might find that people who have really not taken a role up till now are stepping in. Okay, and discussions regarding death decisions. How do we do that? The kindest thing you can actually do is let the family know that the time has come. Okay, how are we going to do this? Sit them down and say, it'll be like, if you notice, even from the last week to now, or from yesterday to now, she's not, she's changed a lot. What has changed? What have you noticed has changed? Okay, she's not awake that much anymore. She's sleeping a lot more. Her energy levels are low. Her breathing has changed. And these are signs for us to say, yes, this is her body shutting down. Okay, you will see fluctuations in her blood pressure, whatever I'm saying, whatever the trajectory is. This is a way for you to say, these are some of the changes you're now going to see. And very kindly let them know that, you know, like practical information, like signs of imminent death. You will find that she's going to sleep more than she's going to be awake. Okay. You might, you need, for those at risk for complicated grief, they might need to be spoken to in a little bit more detail. You need to get more support system people involved. You need to get the family involved and saying, you know, I know we're all going through this very difficult time, but here is your sister who might need a little bit more, you know, a few more conversations within the family, so on and so forth. Practical decision making, please know that when this time comes, a lot of people go numb in terms of not being able to think straight. So we do a little bit of the cognitive heavy lifting for them. Now is a good time to say, who else in the family do you want present? Because now is the time to call them. Okay. Would you like to be at home? Now, if the trajectory is relatively manageable, then it can be managed at home. But or something, they might, it's better to be in the hospital or whatever. Like, but that's a conversation to be had with the family. Where would you like? Okay, we're in the hospital right now. We have a few, we transport her safely back home. Would you like us to do that? Okay. Who is to be notified? Who else needs to be informed? Caregiver with. And it's, I mean, these are just a few examples, but I'm sure that, you know, this will give you a sense of what questions you can ask them. It's not always now, the death has happened, so now is the time. You might have to wait a little while. You have to, what you're trying need it. What you need to do to make that happen is to connect with social support systems who the bereaved trust. Like the eco-map tells you, the neighbors are very close. The cousins who handle, they handle this part. Or let's call someone from, let's call their priest, whoever, you know, people that they trust. And at least, and assist the family in filling out death certificate for families to do. And gently guide them as to, you know, what the process is. You will find that there is someone in the family who is taking on this task. They are the instrument. Grieving has to do with problem solving. So find that person in the family who is the more instrumental and say, okay, here's the process. Okay. At least one team member should be with the family until they leave the hospital premises, if this is happening in the hospital, because it's important for them to have some sort of support and continuity. It's a terrible thing to have the family then find themselves on their own when they're leaving for home. And ideally, this can happen now, like I said, if it's only if it's appropriate, a medical person connected to the care of the deceased to answer any question they may have about the death process. Okay, this happened. Was this, what exactly happened? So in my case, I had someone present and they explained to me that this basically what has happened is a cardiac arrest. And it's likely that, you know, because I saw some contortion in the face and stuff. And my question was she in pain? And I was told that no, that's not a sign of her being in pain. It's happened very quickly, but you know, this is what biologically happened in the last hour. It actually goes a long way. Okay, 2 weeks after the death. Now, we are doing all of this where we see the family off, we help them with all these documents, we help them with all these practical issues. Why 2 weeks? What is the logic? Rituals to complete, yes. Giving space. That's when the family and friends might stop checking in. And you're left with your entire emotional load. Yeah. So typically in most cultures, we have the first 13 days, yeah? We have prayers, we have the funeral, we have the prayer service, we have the 10th day, some people have the 4th day, some people have the 13th day, and then after that, most people have the 40th day. And it's actually beautiful to me that across different spiritual traditions, there is a certain kind of similarity. There must be something there. But you're right. This is when the activity dies down. All the relatives who've come in from different parts of the country, they've left. The main rituals are over. Now, the only thing left to do is maybe a couple of smaller rituals or so on. And this is where the secondary losses start coming up. Remember what we said? Secondary loss and future losses. Secondary losses are coming up now. Suddenly, the role has shifted within the family. Responsibilities have shifted. All the things that were left unattended for so many months now need to be attended to. This is also where the solitude of the, this is where how lonely a role, the caregiving role can be comes to the surface, right? And like some of you said, there's a void. This is all I did for the last, whatever, how many ever months or years of my life. And now I'm suddenly by myself. So what are we going to talk to them about at this time? We need to assess, what are we trying to do scientifically is we're trying to assess the level of adaptation. You can do this through a phone call. If you can do a home visit, nothing like it. A good, safe way to enter is ask about the rituals and ceremonies. It'll give you an insight into the family. It'll also give you an insight into the dynamics. Who all attended? How did they cope with it? If you are able to make a home visit, you can also physically assess their functionality and level of engagement. If I'm talking to them on the phone, I'm not going to be able to tell if they're talking to me from their bed, which they have not left for the past 3 days. But if I visit them, their physical demeanor will tell me a lot about how they're coping. This is where you bring in a positive memory. This is probably the time when you need to ask them to share a positive memory, or you share a positive memory about the person who has died if you knew them well enough. Offer very specific and practical assistance that you can follow through on. I cannot stress this enough. It has to be specific, it has to be practical, it has to be something you can follow through on. Please do not say, call me anytime. I'm here if you need anything. Because by saying that, you're giving them more work to do. They're as it is coping. Now, if you say, what can I do for you? You're giving them one more thing to think about. Don't burden them with that. If you know them well enough, you could offer to say, hey, can I get you your groceries? Would you like me to take the children out for a, for a visit to the park? Or something like that. Can I organize some meals? Yeah. If you're from the healthcare profession, you can ask about their sleeping patterns. You can ask about their appetite. You can ask if you can put them in touch with a healthcare provider. Would you like, can I bring someone over just to look into these aspects of your health? Things like that, very specific. In the course of your relationship with them, if it has been a longish relationship, or even not long, but if you've gotten to know them well over the last few weeks and months, this is a time, if you have a trusting relationship, to bring up any other concerns that they may have shared with you earlier and ask how things are on that front. For instance, you know, yeah, I'm the one who has to make all these decisions. Yeah. And, like I'm constantly having to manage all the financial decisions. And yeah, my brother is, I'm not talking about my brother here, but my brother's very supportive, but he doesn't like to get into, he's just emotional all the time. He doesn't want to make any decisions about the house. And now again, I have to sit and think about all of these things. Now, you will find like caregivers will tell you their concerns from beforehand. I'm worried about financial security. I'm worried about now the kids. Yeah. Like, how am I going to talk to them about the death of this person or the sickness of this person? So that's your entry point. How are the kids handling it? You were worried that they may not be able to understand what has just happened. Have you been able to have a conversation with them yet? Are you feeling a little bit more supported by people in your family, or are things still the same? How secure are you feeling, with regard to all your expenses and things? Now, you may not be able to fix any of those things, but letting them know that you remember what their concerns are is a good way for them to express their grief and their emotions to you. Okay. And finally, we follow up 1 month after that 2 weeks. And again, why? Now the 40th day is over. The other ceremonies are done. Now after the secondary losses, the next set of losses. This is where you're reassessing your purpose, your meaning, your, re-engaging with the workforce, all of those things, the restorative activities, ideally. This is where those thoughts at least start coming into your head, even if you're not acting on them. And this is also a time where you will see if there is any long-term impact on their physical health. You may not have been able to do this in the first 2 weeks because it's too soon. But now you have some distance, and if they're not coping well, now it is going to show up. Weight loss, sleep disruptions, appetite disruptions, hygiene issues, things like that. This is now it's going to show up, and now you're going to know what is the result of the last month's experiences. This is also where you assess levels of social support. People will rush to be there in the first few weeks. Now is when you know who's really there. Now you will also know whether they need support groups or other resources from you. If they've dropped out of the workforce, ask landscape questions. Landscape questions are questions that you don't go direct. You ask about the landscape. Like I said, how are you managing with your finances? You had a couple of loans that you said needed to be paid off. What's the status with that? And that will sort of tell you whether what their situation is with, getting back into work. They say, I'm not ready to get back to work, but maybe I'll take up a project or two. I'm looking for something that I can do part-time. And what are they currently struggling with? And these are your questions that you would ask, your dignity questions and your meaning and hope questions, right? Tell me what's on your mind right now, the most. What's bothering you the most right now? This is where you'll get what they are struggling with. And very important, don't shy away from addressing the deceased by name, because we have this, again, this conspiracy of silence when it comes to those who have died. And that can be extremely brutally painful. So these are the 5 sort of, I've tried to simplify it to the best of my ability to tell you, sort of just give you some guardrails around what we can do along the way for bereavement support. Of course, these are not hard and fast. You will have to use your own intuition and your experience and your relationship with the person that you're supporting to see what can be employed at what time. And finally, I think I'll just share some do's and don'ts. Like I said, don't say, call me if you need anything. Like I've just said, it'll put unnecessary pressure. Offer specific forms of practical support that you think they might need help with, that you can definitely do. like babysitting the children, making an evening meal, for elderly parents, picking up groceries, etc., so on and so forth. Don't avoid taking the deceased person's name. Share a happy memory or an act of kindness you experienced. If you didn't know them personally, ask the bereaved person to tell you something about them. Don't rush in to say anything for the sake of it. Silence is a very, very powerful ally. You can even say, I don't have the words. I don't have the words to comfort you. I just want you to know that I'm here. Okay, don't say he or she is in a better place. Oh my God, we have a great tendency to say this. How many of us have heard this? She's in a better place. Yeah, much better place. No, whatever said and done, we have to acknowledge that the pain of losing the person is very hard for the bereaved person. Okay, so we, rather than saying, oh, she's in a better place, he's in a better place, this, I can't imagine how difficult this is for you even now. Please don't say you were such a good daughter. But no, I'm joking. But it's really important to acknowledge the feeling. Okay. Avoid comparisons or telling your own story. At that point, allow the person to feel their own emotions of what for what they are, right? So I've used a series of comparisons to sort of highlight and illustrate a few points here. But if I were to go and sit with somebody who's actually bereaved at that point, then the last thing I want to do is tell them my story. I want to actually just sit with them either in silence or get their story from them. And finally, I love this particular, I know some of you might be familiar with this diagram, where it says people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time, but in reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. So this idea that time is a healer, that pain goes away in time, I've personally never been a subscriber to that thought. This has made a lot of sense to me personally. So this is there's a beautiful website. It's called What's Your Grief? It's a great resource. There's lots of stuff up there where people come and share different experiences and things. They talk about different kinds of grief. So that's also a good resource to just tap into if you're curious. Yeah. So, oh my God, Shri Priya, give me a medal. I've finished in time. Okay. So, all right. So we have a few minutes, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay. What after that? How long can we do bereavement sessions? So, Nita, what after the, I'm sorry, I don't know when exactly that question came in. After the 1 month, is that what the question was? Okay. As often as you think is necessary. See, if you're engaging with somebody as a healthcare provider, then I think our job is not done until we know that the family is coping with it in a healthy way, or at least they've got each other's back and they're seeking support and care and, tapping into their social support system. If there is signs of complicated grief, I mean, I would do another check-in 6 months later. And if 6 months later some things are still shaky, then, maybe some other interventions are needed. Typically, we don't really diagnose for complicated grief or depression, at least for 3-4 months after the bereavement has happened, because it's too messy, that period. You can't make a clear diagnosis. But if you're seeing that the person has not engaged with other people, they're not, like all the signs of depression where they're feeling zero affect, no pleasure in anything, not engaging with other people, then it's time to bring in some clinical interventions. If it's somebody who you know on a personal basis that you're providing support to, then it's entirely up to you. I mean, these are some experiential learnings. There's literature around it, but these are practices that you can employ even in your relationships with people close to you. So I would say that it's entirely up to your sense of how much longer they need that support. I still find it very useful and comforting when someone will come and ask me some of these questions 1.5 years later. Because depending on the kind of relationship it was, what happens is then the first death anniversary will come, people will remember. The first birthday will come, people will remember. after that, that person fades from other people's memories, and the bereaved person feels very lonely because they're like, am I the only person who remembers this person? So it's nice to check in with them, especially when they think that no one else remembers. Yeah, so I have a really close friend who, on the anniversary of my adoptive mom's death, 23 years later, will message me on that day and says, I know this might be a difficult day for you. That's it. We don't have long conversations, but just the fact that I'm not the only one witnessing that life makes it a big thing. Yeah. Shlaka, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. Um, so I was just wondering, in the very first session when we started this course, you mentioned that most of the palliative care services in the country are free or, at not very prohibitive. But, with the last few sessions and even today's session, the kind of work you guys are doing is so significant and so profound. And how is it that you're offering this for free or at a negligible amount?
How are we offering it for free? Okay, so I'm actually very proud to say that Pallium started its Sunday home care service yesterday. Sunday was usually the day off for the whole clinical team. I think we're doing it because the need is there, Shalaka. And I don't know. I mean, we try and get all of these services funded, right? Because a home care team, whether it's a mental health support team or whether it's a physiatry team, there is a need that has been defined. And I think we come from the space where people have already been put through the meat grinder in terms of financial expenses. That something like this, how do we charge for it? A lot of people will question the sustainability of something like this. I don't doubt it. And maybe for some of the smaller, newer organizations, that is a challenge. So I can't speak to that. But um, I also find that in a lot of palliative care organizations, if the service provided has been done well, and sometimes only compassion is not enough, you need competence. I can't go there and be compassionate and rubbish being coming out of my mouth, right? So if the care being given is compassionate and competent, very often your biggest supporters will be the bereaved family. And I will say this, that in a lot of palliative care organizations, the core funding comes from individual donations of people whose family members we've looked after. And that's not just the truth in Pallium. I can tell you that majority of the palliative care services in the country rely heavily on that. And it's not something that is elicited. It comes as a gesture of goodwill. So, like I said, it doesn't make the most. I mean, if you're an MBA person, you're like, what the hell kind of format is this? But it works out. And of course, after a while, your work speaks for you, and then you're able to approach funders for very specific projects and things like that. So during the pandemic, we actually set up a grief helpline. And what we did is we just put the call out, and we had about 18 counselors from around the country sign up for free, like pro bono, because they were also at home and they felt that there was a need. So I think it's about articulating the need in a way that makes sense, and then your work shows it. Yeah. So I don't know. I have not answered your question properly at all, but
No, I understood, and it's not just the Pallium India example, but across the space. Recently, one of my uncles he died from IPF, pulmonary fibrosis, and well-to-do family. And when we started palliative care, then they didn't take a cent from us. And I was wondering, why not? Maybe take money from us, and you can help those families which are financially challenged. But no, they provided the palliative care services were the best, and they provided everything, and I was so happy and inspired by them. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm doing this today is because I was inspired by their work. This was in Bombay, but yeah, I mean, some sustainability in the business model. I mean, sorry, not a business model wrong term, but I also don't know the business side of things. So I end up using those terms, but some sustainability in the financial model for this needs to come through.
it's not at all easy. See, we're an NGO, we're a charitable trust, so we work like this. But I do know of places where they have a cross subsidy model, where they will charge people who are of a particular economic bracket. They won't overcharge. They will charge what what covers actual cost. And then that sort of cross subsidizes people who can't afford it. And various people employ that model, and that also works. Sorry, there's a very important question in the chat box. Do you mind if I just take that? Okay. If I commit to bereavement support after some sessions, I realize I can't handle the case. What should I do? If referring to another person is possible or not? I'm very glad this question was asked, because a grief, I think, is not just a very treacherous, but a very tricky territory. You are really going into the darkest corners of somebody else's mind and heart. And not all of us are prepared for what we will find there sometimes. Your first duty of care is to admit that this is not something that you are equipped, not in the sense that you're abandoning the person. Say that this seems like some very difficult emotion, or it seems like it sounds quite complicated, and I am going to need to involve other people in your care. I'm assuming that if you have been for a few bereavement sessions, you have established a certain level of rapport. You have also gotten access to information now that you're feeling overwhelmed by, because that person has let you in that much. So it's about delicately, first of all, saying that I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, but I would like to involve people who are maybe a little bit more equipped in supporting me in taking care of this. Not an easy conversation to have, but I think that question is a very important question. Do not, one, ghost the person and leave. Two, do not attempt to do something when you are not feeling up to it, because it'll only get worse. And you can also say that in cases like these, we typically work in a team, and with your permission, I'd like to bring one more person. Sometimes just having a third person in the room makes things easier. Yeah. So it's absolutely okay to admit to that. And there have been times where I have said to someone that I'm a little bit out of my depth here, because I'm not quite sure on how you would like me to proceed with you. So do you mind if I just, talk about what we are talking about with and normally we don't have this practice in India as strictly as we should, but if you're getting into this line of work, you need to have peer supervision and you need to have supervision. So typically, peer supervision will be other mental health professionals who you can bounce cases off, because if you're getting stuck with a case, the best thing to do is talk to another mental health profession about it, and they'll tell you where they might give you some fresh eyes on how that is happening. Okay, so typically I would say, if you're going into this line of work, make sure you have a peer supervision network, or at least a few people who, so if you have trained to be a counselor, your teaching institute should be able to tell you who you can be. There is the Indian Association of Professional Supervision, IAPS. They're based out of Chennai. Their job is to provide professional supervision to mental health healthcare providers, and they are good at, they do provide supervision for the Pallium India psychologists as well, because especially in our cases, you need somebody with a little bit of distance to see where your transference is happening, counter transference is happening. Why is this case difficult for you? Is there a mental health issue that this person is exhibiting that you're not equipped to deal with? Then who should you refer that person to? So I would say, in prevention is better than cure. So go in with that system in place and be sure that you tap into that system when you need it. Okay, we are at the close of the session. I'll be sharing this PowerPoint as well as some notes. And please look up Catherine Mannix's book. Please look up the grief, What's Your Grief website. Some great resources there. And if you have any questions, you're very welcome to email me and I'll be happy to take it forward. So okay, sorry, there's one more question. Is it possible to separate out your emotional state from professional life and your personal family life? Ooh. I think it's not just possible, it is imperative. It is absolutely imperative. There came a point where my husband said to me, if we're going to talk about death every dinner, then maybe this is not going to work out between us, because and it is a lonely job, because he worked in wildlife conservation, so in the evening we'd get together. How was your day? Oh, I saw so many elephants. How was your day? Yes, 3 people in my unit died. So it was never a good conversation between the two of us. But you need to have people that you can unload with, and at the same time get the care and support you need. It's not an easy line of work to be in. You tend to get a little, deeply involved in it. And I'll tell you another funny story before I let you go. I mean, I had a really long week, and then I came home, and to me, reading is, relaxing. So I was reading something which really sparked me up. So I sent that link to at least 3 people, and our chairman wrote back to me saying, are you seriously reading a paper on euthanasia at 11 o'clock in the night and telling me that it's a great read? So you have to, because so now I have a rule that I don't read more than one work-related book in a month, and try and keep some levity and brevity in my life apart from work. It's very important. So I hope you all take good care of yourselves, and I will see you next session whenever I have to see you. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Smriti ma'am, thank you everyone for joining in. The last part, ma'am, you said I will not take it for granted that you are keeping separate time for your personal life as well. No.
We're trying to spread a much healthier culture here, Shri.
Great. So thank you
Bye.
everyone for joining us.
Thank
See you in the next
you.
session. Till then, everyone, take
See
care.
you.
Keep
Bye.
spreading happiness. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.